Well, as was mentioned, as we come to sort of the end of chapter 10, we are approaching the conclusion of that second teaching block, where over the last few weeks, really since Mark chapter 8, verse 32, Jesus has really focused his time and attention, his teaching on the disciples. Teaching centered on that subject, that theme of true discipleship. What does it mean to be a follower of Christ? And we also have to sort of put this within its historical context. Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem. And we talked about that last week. This is the last time for this particular journey. The cross is looming on the horizon. And coming with that is the eventual resurrection and ascension into heaven. And so throughout this period of time, Jesus is really readying the disciples for that event of his death, but then also what follows on after that, their call into ministry leadership, the growth of the church. You just open up the book of Acts and you see how rapidly the church is growing. He's preparing them for the spread of the gospel around the world and the part that they will have in that, their call and unique role in the growth of the church. And so as we come this morning to our passage, the instruction that Jesus will share, again, is important for those early days of the church. And the lesson that we will see today is that following Jesus means becoming a servant. Following Jesus means becoming a servant. Following Jesus requires one to lay aside the self-serving attitude and become self-sacrificing. As we think about this lesson, it's not just an isolated teaching for the disciples within the context of the early church, but this is a necessary lesson for us today. Each one of us need to know that following Jesus today means serving God and serving his people. Well, before we jump into the instruction that Jesus gives here, we need to take note of the setting. What is happening in the story? Again, Mark's gospel is a record of the life and ministry of Jesus, these daily events that are recorded. And we begin in verse 32. It says, "And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him." As we've mentioned each week for the last several weeks, Jesus and the disciples are on their way to Jerusalem, and it's clear from this verse here that Jesus is resolute about what he must do. We just see it in the description. He is walking ahead of the disciples. He's leading the way. He is determined to get to Jerusalem. And if you kind of picture here in your mind a family who is trying to catch a plane. They're late to the airport. And you might have that scene in your head. Maybe it's one you've experienced. And you have dad out there just leading the charge through the airport, moving as fast as he can, determined to get to the gate before it is shut. And if you're one of the children, you are both amazed and afraid. You're amazed because you've never seen Dad move like this. You've never seen him command a crowd as people are just getting out of his way as he's making his way to the gate. But you're also afraid because you've never seen Dad move like this before, and you don't know what's going to happen when he gets to the end. Well, in a sense, that's sort of what we have going on here with the disciples. They're amazed at the conviction of Jesus. The conviction of Jesus to get to Jerusalem. Jesus isn't messing around here. He's not wasting time. There is real determination to get to this place. But we see in the text they're also afraid. They're, I think, afraid of the inevitable. Remember, these guys have seen the showdowns between Jesus and the religious leaders. They know that the scribes and the Pharisees are annoyed with Jesus. They've heard the plot between these religious leaders and their own enemies, the Herodians, who've come together and are seeking to destroy Jesus. And these guys have to be thinking, with this kind of determination, with this conviction to speak truth in Jerusalem, Jesus is stepping into fire. The threat of being destroyed is imminent. if he shows up in this place. And it's in this setting that Jesus once again calls these men to listen to what he has to say. Look at verses 33 and 34. He's brought the disciples to himself, and he says to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." Well, here we have the third passion prediction. The third time within these last just 3 chapters where Jesus is going to tell the disciples what lies ahead for him, is covering suffering and death on the cross. And as he's speaking of this, he's really applying the Old Testament prophecies to himself. And we see this once again in the use of the title Son of Man. It's something that we've seen Jesus use throughout Mark's Gospel. And if we remember, it's a title which describes his humanity and his humility. Jesus took on flesh. He became a man. It's a title of deity. In him, the fullness of God dwells bodily. He used it to speak of how he is able to forgive sin, how he is the Lord of the Sabbath, how he came to save sinners, how he will rise from the dead, how he will execute judgment. Things that only God can do are applied to this title, Son of Man. It's a title that is a fulfillment of prophecy. The first time we came across this title, we quoted Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, a passage in the Old Testament where Daniel saw the glory and worship and an everlasting kingdom given to the Messiah, and who in that passage is called the Son of Man. And so all of this is what Jesus means when he uses this title. But as we see in the text, it's not just these glorious thoughts that are applied to who he is. Think about Isaiah chapter 53, verse 3. It says that he was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. This is probably not what the disciples had in mind when they heard the term Son of Man. But this is what Jesus mentions. And he goes on to explain there, he will be delivered over to those who hate him. They will condemn him to death. They will treat him unfairly, illegally, unjustly. He's then handed over to the Gentiles. He'll be handed over to the Romans. And to the ear of a Jew, this would be extremely scandalous. Something like this was a picture of being removed from God's covenant community, being outside of God's presence. And as this goes on, this experience is not just merely unpleasant, but it is utterly agonizing. As we see, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, would be spat upon, would be mocked, would be flogged. To give some description here, Isaiah 52, verse 14, his appearance was so marred as beyond human semblance. This deliverance would leave him unrecognizable. But it's not even just the physical suffering that Jesus would face. Psalm 22 tells us that the wrath of God is poured out on him as he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And at this he would breathe his last. He would die, executed in the most excruciating way. And then Jesus tells us at the end of this passage that after all of this, he will rise again. There is life, there is resurrection. And so this whole description, this whole passion prediction would shock the disciples. It surprises them. Jesus has mentioned his suffering and his death before, but with this type of description and language hasn't been present until now. And Mark doesn't tell us the response of the disciples to this prediction, but if we were to turn to Luke 18, where this same event is recorded in Luke's gospel, we're told that they did not understand any of these things. They did not grasp what was said. These men, they understood what Jesus was describing. They could picture it. They probably saw some of these things throughout their lives, but they could not understand how this fit into God's plan. This whole notion of a suffering Messiah was beyond their grasp. It's something that they're going to continue to struggle with until after that day. And so as this is seen in what happens next, we move from this passion prediction to the lesson for discipleship. And really the lesson that following Jesus means becoming a servant. And so that's going to be where we spend most of our time this morning, is looking at this lesson of discipleship. And there's two key things for us to take notice of. First is the problem of a self-serving attitude. The problem of a self-serving attitude. And secondly, the serious call for self-sacrifice, which we will see coming back to that passion prediction plays an important part in that call. Well, before we read this passage, we see James and John are two disciples. We've met them along our study. They're two disciples who are very close to Jesus, along with Peter. They've experienced some things that the other disciples had not experienced. So they were brought up to the time of the Transfiguration. They were brought into the house where Jesus raised Jairus' daughter. In Matthew, we're also told that their mother is the one who actually approaches Jesus for the first time with this question. And it's important to note there that their mother happens to be Mary's sister, Jesus' aunt. And so therefore, these two men are close relatives to Jesus. And so with this background, both within the context of ministry and in the context of family, James and John come to Jesus with a request. And their request is asked in both misunderstanding and selfishness. Look at verses 35 through 37. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." The misunderstanding of their question is really a result of their lack of full understanding. Now, these two men, they clearly believed that Jesus was headed for glory. And in that, they have a correct conclusion, a correct application of the title Son of Man. However, they have not been listening to all of what Jesus has said. They've not been paying attention to how his glory would come. They do not understand. And we've seen and mentioned it before that these men, all of the disciples, including James and John, they think that the Messiah is coming to overthrow Rome. He's coming to sit on an earthly throne in Israel to bring Judaism back to its former glory. In other words, they're looking for an earthly king. And as they sit and they look at Jesus, they watch what he does, they hear what he has to say, this is the right guy for the job. He fits all of the job description requirements. But they've missed the point of all of these Old Testament passages. Their understanding is misinformed. And so this leads them into a request that showcases their heart, their selfish motivation. They ask Jesus, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left." They're looking at the situation. They're looking at their position, their proximity to Jesus, and they begin to apply the world's thinking and practice. You know, as is often seen, those who are on the inside, those with a good relationship or a benefit to a ruler or the person in charge, they are the ones who get a place of honor. And to sit in the right or left hand of the one on the throne is a sign of being in a position of high authority and prominence. And that's what these guys are looking for. And essentially what we are seeing is bad theology, which is resulting in a more inward focus. And we can look at these guys and say, how can you come to this conclusion? What's wrong with you? And yet how often do we look at Jesus with this same misunderstanding? With bad theology. He's my ticket to heaven. Therefore I can live as I want, as long as I say I believe in Jesus. He's my genie in a bottle. Any request that I bring, he's obligated to grant to me. He's the cleaner of my mess, and therefore I should no longer experience any problems in my life. At the heart of all of these is self-focus, using Jesus for my pleasure, my benefit, my happiness. Well, to this, Jesus responds in verse 38. He says to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." Jesus asks a very pointed question, and uses two metaphors here as sort of a way to highlight their faulty thinking and to emphasize really the reality of suffering that is ahead. The idea there of drinking the cup is something that's found throughout the Old Testament, and it's a way to picture fully experiencing the wrath of God. And Jesus is applying this to himself, and this will be seen in much greater detail in a few chapters when in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays to the Father, "Remove this cup from me, yet not my will but yours." The experiencing the wrath of God is also pictured in the usage of the word baptism. And here we have the idea of full immersion into the divine plan of God. And in this case, the overwhelming flood-like plunge into judgment for sin. And basically, Jesus is taking these two metaphors, and he says to these guys, "Can you take that on? Can you handle that?" And look at how they both respond. A quick and confident yes. Yes, we are able. And clearly, they have not thought this through. Little do they know that in just a little while, in the night when Jesus is arrested and he is tried, when they should be right there on his left and on his right, they will flee from him. They will run. And to this, Jesus reveals that the reality is these men will suffer. And their suffering, at least outwardly, will appear to be like Jesus. If you think about church history, James, the one spoken of here, he's the first disciple who will be killed for the faith. John, he'll be the last disciple alive, living in banishment because of his commitment to Christ. So Jesus is pointing out that while no disciple of his ever suffers like him, bearing the wrath of God, his followers are called to identify with him, and suffering in this world for the faith is a sign of that union with Christ. Both John and James will experience this. And the reality is that every true follower of Jesus Christ will know suffering for the faith. But with this, Jesus returns to the initial question, the sitting at his right hand or his left, and he tells them, "It is not mine to give. This decision is reserved for the Father." But this is not just a static answer. It's not just a yes or no answer, but this is really a challenge to the hearts of these two brothers. And the reality is that this question that they asked is not the kind of question asked by those who sit in these seats. These seats are not reserved for someone who seeks self-honor and power and glory. They're reserved for those who seek to glorify and honor the Lord. This is the heart of a true follower. Well, you can imagine as this unfolds, this conversation, that conflict is going to arise. And that's what happens in verse 41. "And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John." The other 10 disciples, they're not happy with these two guys. But it's not because of their blatant self-focus. It's because they beat them to Jesus with this request. The reality is this is the heart of all the disciples, and we see that as Jesus confronts this. The problem is that all 12 have this same heart attitude. That's the natural, sinful attitude of me first. And it's not something that is just natural to these 12 men, but it is natural to all of us. We all struggle with this. Well, Jesus, he calls for self-sacrifice in the midst of this competitiveness which is unfolding, verses 42 to 44. And Jesus called them to him again and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all." And Jesus begins with a very clear and concise exhortation. Do not be like the world. He's saying that's what you're acting like right now. Don't be like the world. Jesus looks at the world's approach to leadership, authority, rule, and he points out what we all know. The world is driven by self-ambition, desire for power, a desire for prominence and position. And to this, Jesus unequivocally states, this must not be the case among his people. Do not be like the world. He goes on then to contrast between the world's view of greatness and God's view of greatness. The world says if you are important, if you have power, if you have prominence, guess what? You have many people who serve you well. But Jesus says if you want to be great, if you want to do great things for God, for the kingdom, then you must be self-sacrificing. And he uses two words to describe this. Important words that show the depth behind the heart of a follower of Jesus Christ. First, the word servant. And this is literally the word for someone who waits tables. So if we have that picture in our mind, it's someone whose job it is to make sure that others are cared for. Secondly, he uses the word slave. And this is obviously much more intense because it's not just one's job, but this is one's life. Their whole focus is upon others and their interests. And this sounds very different from the world's view of leadership and rule. If you were ever to go to a leadership seminar and someone were to say to you, to be a good leader, you must be a servant and a slave, I think we would all sit up and take notice. This isn't what I paid for. In fact, I don't think we probably even like hearing this description. We all like the world's view, right? Others serving me, making sure I'm happy, doing my bidding, making sure I'm comfortable. That's what we all like. But the Lord is saying that true followers are to consider others, everyone, their master, to focus on serving them, seeking to meet their needs. This call, then, this exhortation is followed up by an example. Look at verse 45. He says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Here we have really the supreme example of this kind of self-sacrificing servant heart. It's in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And this description, this example, is in complete juxtaposition to the world. Jesus, the Son of God, has come to serve. And he's done so in the most extraordinary way by giving his life, becoming the greatest sacrifice. We know from Scripture that the penalty, the cost of our sin is death. But what did Jesus do? He came to earth. He put on flesh. He went to the cross. He died in our place. He paid that penalty. It is Jesus Christ who bore the wrath and judgment of God upon sin in the place of his people. This self-sacrifice is life-changing, and it is life-giving. This is probably one of the most important verses in all of Scripture. And I like what John Piper comments here. He says, this verse is what turns Christianity into gospel. This verse is truly good news to sinners. And as God's people, he has called us, and we have the privilege to not only share this news, but as we see working out in this text, to live like him, of giving ourselves for the good and benefit of others, of serving and being generous, thinking first of the needs that others have, doing what we can to bless those around us. And again, we don't just have this command from God, do this to make me happy, but we have an example by God. And what follows in verses 46 through 52 is Jesus demonstrating this servanthood in very practical ways. We've come across similar accounts to this. But let me read this story, and then we'll see this servanthood in practice. Verse 46, and they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. We've seen this many times in Mark's gospel. Jesus is walking along. He's leaving Jericho. He spent some time there on his way to Jerusalem. He's joined by the disciples. He's followed by a crowd. And once again, we're not surprised when we hear that this is a great crowd. And at this point, once again, he's met by someone who is really on the periphery of society, a man by the name of Bartimaeus who is blind. And if you recall, as we think about someone with this condition, they would be left outside of mainstream society. They were pushed to the margins. They were neglected. But not only that, they would have been stigmatized by this blindness. Oftentimes, conditions like this were seen to be God's punishment. So they were just pushed out of any aspect of daily life. In spite of this, we find what we often see, someone in this situation calling out to Jesus, seeking his help. Mark actually tells us that Bartimaeus is crying out. And in the original language, this is shouting or screaming. Again, you think about someone in his condition. He's experienced nothing but neglect in his life. People pass him by. They ignore him every single day. And so he is going to do whatever he can do to get the attention of Jesus. And to this, we see the natural human response, be quiet. Tells us that the crowd rebukes him. It's actually the same thing that the disciples did last week with the parents bringing the little children to them, pushing them out. That's what they're doing to Bartimaeus here. The crowd gets annoyed by this man. They try to get him quiet, to get him away from their gathering. But we see this only makes him more bold and determined to get the attention of Jesus. And we can look at this scene and we can sort of build this picture of chaos, right? You have this large crowd all sort of meeting around Jesus. They're moving through town. You can imagine the dust is flying everywhere. There's lots of talking, lots of noise. There's this man off to the side yelling, screaming, making a scene. But if we stop for a moment and we look at what this man says, we notice the depth of understanding. Yes, he's crying out, he's shouting for Jesus, but he says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. This man knew his Bible. This man knew the Old Testament. He understood the promise of the Messiah. Back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Lord promised David that the Messiah would be his greater son. That he would be the heir to the throne, that he would be the fulfillment of all the promises, that his rule would be forever. And this man looks up and he sees Jesus, whose earthly father is Joseph and whose mother Mary are both descendants of David. And so he cries out with this title. Bartimaeus is declaring, here is Israel's Messiah. Here is the deliverer of God's people. Here is the promised one who has come to save. It's an extraordinary affirmation of who Jesus is from an unlikely individual. To go along with this, he also understands who he is as a person. What does Bartimaeus say? Have mercy on me. He needs Christ. And in one way, this phrase, have mercy on me, is a plea for help and assistance in his condition. But at a deeper level, it is a realization that he is not deserving of the Lord's work, and yet he trusts in the kindness of God. We could say, in spite of his blindness, he saw the light. And this is where we find Jesus modeling this heart of servanthood that he has just called for his disciples. Remember, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's out ahead of the disciples in the previous passage. He's leading with passion and determination. What lies ahead for Jesus is the most significant event in all of history. And we can ask the question, does he really need to be bothered by this blind man on the side of the road? Well, that's exactly what he allows. In the midst of chaos, Jesus stops. And he calls for this man to come to him. And I just love Bartimaeus here. I mean, in spite of being able to see, what does it say he does? He springs up and he runs to Jesus. He can't see a thing, but he's running to Jesus. And Jesus asks him the same question that he asked James and John. What do you want me to do for you? But we have a very different answer in this case. He says, let me recover my sight. James and John, they both asked for status, for prominence, for glory. Bartimaeus, he asked for ordinary health. He simply sought the Lord's mercy. He calls Jesus rabbi. And its usage in this setting is one of confession. Jesus is master. Jesus is Lord. And really what we see from Bartimaeus is, yes, he's looking for physical sight, but much more than that, he recognizes his spiritual blindness. And Jesus knows this. Verse 52. Go your way. Your faith has made you well. It's a powerful example of servanthood for the disciples. It's a powerful example for us. At the heart of Jesus' ministry is love, compassion, and care for others. A willingness to stop. A willingness to engage. A willingness to encounter, to minister to an individual in need. As we come to a close, there's two things for us to consider. First, we are all like Bartimaeus. We may not be physically blind, but we are all spiritually blind. The scriptures tell us we are all sinners. And we need to recognize that Jesus Christ is the Savior. He is the deliverer. He is the promised Messiah. He's the one who redeems and sets us free from sin and brings us into relationship with God. It is Jesus Christ alone. And so this morning, if you have not trusted Christ, can I urge you to read the scriptures, to get to know Jesus, listen to his call, put your faith in his work on the cross and follow him. Like Bartimaeus, you can know salvation in Jesus Christ. You can experience joy which causes you to spring up and to run after Jesus. Secondly, and really drawing from the big idea of this passage, for Christians this morning, the question is, are we serving like Jesus Or are we serving like James and John? Do our lives revolve around what I must do? What I need? How can I get ahead? Or do we look at life and see opportunities to show care and compassion to others? To serve their needs even when it's not beneficial, maybe even inconvenient for us. And this is a challenge, I know. It's not easy to take this on board. Our inclination is to look out for me. But Jesus calls us to servanthood and self-sacrifice. And while that seems counterintuitive, it is for sure countercultural. The reality is there's no greater privilege or joy than living in light of the gospel change in our hearts. To reflect on the work of Christ. To reflect on his heart for people. So might we be individual Christians? Might we be a church that is self-sacrificing, cares for others, and declares the wonderful good news of Jesus?